She sat in silence for weeks, asking God one question. "Are you still here?" The answer came. Not in a dream, not from the sky, but from a stranger with trembling hands and a folded note. It began on a morning so still, even the birds seemed unsure if they should sing. Light filtered weakly through the curtains, but it felt distant, as if the sun had chosen to shine elsewhere that day. She sat at the edge of her bed, unmoving, hands resting on her lap like they had forgotten their purpose. She wasn't tired. She wasn't sad. She just wasn't there. For weeks, she had been going through the motions, showering, answering emails, even smiling when necessary. But behind her eyes was a quiet, persistent question that never stopped echoing. Where are you, God? She had once been a believer with fire in her soul, the kind of woman who would pray for strangers on buses, who found meaning in the smallest leaf falling in autumn. She remembered those days not with bitterness, but with longing. That version of herself felt like someone she had once met but could no longer recall clearly. The faith that used to carry her now felt like a photograph. Beautiful, yes, but lifeless. Silence had become the answer to her prayers. It wasn't an angry silence. It was colder than that. Indifferent. And in that silence, doubt crept in, not with force, but slowly, like mist in the morning, covering everything without warning. She had read somewhere, God is never late, but he is rarely early. That used to comfort her. Now it only reminded her of time, how much of it had passed, and how little had changed. As a counselor, she had often told her patients that silence could be healing, that sometimes, when life grows quiet, the soul begins to speak. But now, in the quiet of her own life, the only voice she heard was her own disbelief, and it was growing louder. She walked into the kitchen, made tea she wouldn't drink, and sat by the window, watching the wind move the trees. Somewhere inside, a small part of her whispered, "Maybe he is still watching." But it was only a whisper, and she had learned not to trust whispers. Scripture says, "Be still, and know that I am God." She had memorized that verse, held it like a shield. But now it felt like a test she kept failing, because in her stillness she felt no knowing, only absence. Yet in that very absence, something subtle stirred. Not a voice, not a sign, just a moment, barely perceptible, where her breath caught in her throat, as if her soul recognized something her mind could not explain. She didn't know it then, but the silence was not empty. It was full, waiting, like a field under snow, asleep but not dead. And in that field, something had begun to move. Something holy. Before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps us a lot. Thank you. That afternoon, the world outside carried on as if nothing were out of place. Children laughed in the distance. Cars passed. Leaves danced quietly across the sidewalk. Life, in its usual rhythm, seemed unaware of her stillness. And perhaps that was what hurt the most, that the world kept turning, even when she felt like she had stopped. She left the house with no destination, walking just to walk. Her feet moved forward while her mind stayed behind. Every face she passed looked like every other, tired, busy, elsewhere. The city was alive, but she felt like a ghost moving through it. She paused outside a small café, the kind tucked into a quiet corner where stories happened but were rarely told. She'd passed it countless times before. Today, for no particular reason, she went inside. The smell of coffee and old wood wrapped around her like a familiar blanket. She chose a seat near the window, where the light fell in long, gentle lines across the table. It was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that reminded her of God's absence, but the kind that made space for something to arrive. She opened her journal, more from habit than purpose, and stared at the blank page. Nothing came. She closed it. Maybe words weren't needed today. The seat across from her pulled back with a soft scrape, and she looked up, startled. An older man stood there. His face was lined but kind. He held a small paper bag in one hand, and in the other, a coffee that had clearly been held too long. It trembled slightly in his grasp. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked, with a tone so gentle it almost wasn't a question. She hesitated, then nodded. He sat down slowly, as if every movement required intention. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. He took out a sandwich, unwrapped it carefully, and began to eat in silence. Then, without looking up, he said, "You've been waiting for something." Her eyes met his. Something in her chest tightened. "Maybe you've been waiting so long," he continued, "that you don't even know what it is anymore." She didn't answer. But something about the way he said it, like someone describing a place he'd once lived, unnerved her. He finally looked at her. Not in the way people usually look, with questions or expectations, but with a stillness that felt strangely familiar. "I used to believe God had forgotten me," he said. "For years, I prayed into silence. My wife died. My son drifted so far I thought he'd never come back. I lost myself. Lost the reason I woke up in the morning." His voice didn't waver. It was not the voice of someone seeking sympathy, but of someone offering truth. "One day," he continued, "I sat on a bench with my head in my hands, thinking about ending it. A child walked by, no more than 5 or 6, and without a word, he came up, hugged me, and walked away. He smiled faintly, eyes distant. I never saw him again, Sora, but I knew God had spoken. Not with thunder, not with miracles, just with a small pair of arms that reminded me I was still seen." She blinked. Once, twice, and then looked away. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded note. He placed it on the table, gently, and stood up. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," he said, "but I think you need to know. You're not invisible, and he's closer than you think." And with that, he was gone. No name, no explanation. She stared at the note for a long time before opening it. Inside, in slightly shaky handwriting, were the words, "Even to your old age and gray hairs I am He. I am He who will sustain you." Isaiah 46:4. Her throat tightened. She felt the burn of tears before she could stop them, not from sadness, but from something else. Recognition. It was not the message itself that shook her. It was the timing. The impossibility of that exact verse, at that exact moment, after all the silence. She sat there long after the table had been cleared, the café half empty now, the light outside dimming. And inside her, the silence began to shift. Not gone, but different. Less like a void, and more like a doorway. She walked home slowly, her steps no longer dragged by weariness, but paced by something new, something almost reverent. The note remained clutched in her coat pocket, pressed against her palm like a lifeline. She hadn't looked at it again. She didn't need to. The words had already taken root. Inside her apartment, the light was soft, golden, and fading. Everything looked the same, but felt different, as if the very air had been stirred, as if the silence she had once dreaded now carried a pulse. She sat by the window again, where the day had first begun. The same chair, the same view, but her eyes saw more now. Not more in quantity, but more in meaning. A woman crossing the street with grocery bags. a young couple arguing quietly, an old man walking a dog who didn't want to walk. Each moment felt intentional, as if life were not just happening, but being shown to her. For the first time in weeks, she opened her Bible, not out of duty, not in search of answers, simply to be with the Word. The pages felt alive beneath her fingers. She let it open where it wished. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. Isaiah 43:2. She closed her eyes. This was no coincidence, not the verse, not the man in the café, not the child in his story. All of it was connected. She could feel it, not with logic, but with the quiet knowing that lives deeper than thought, the kind that doesn't need to explain itself. In her work as a counselor, she had seen trauma rearrange people. She'd watched grief harden the softest hearts, watched silence become unbearable to those who needed meaning. She had told others so many times that healing wasn't linear, that sometimes the soul returns in fragments. Now she understood it anew. Healing doesn't always arrive with clarity. Sometimes it comes like a stranger with trembling hands and a paper bag. Sometimes it's just a verse scribbled on a piece of paper that refuses to be forgotten. She thought back to her childhood, to a memory that surfaced uninvited. She had been 6, afraid of the dark, hiding under the covers after a nightmare. Her mother had come in, sat by her bed, and said nothing. Just placed a hand on her back and breathed with her. No words, no promises, just presence. And that had been enough. She opened her eyes. Her breath was steady now. Her heart still ached, but not in despair. It ached like soil aches before it breaks open with new roots. There was movement inside. There was life again. Maybe God hadn't spoken because he wanted her to feel him first. Not hear, not see, just feel. Like that child's hug in the stranger's story. Like the silence that wrapped around her now, no longer empty, but sacred. She looked at the note again, slowly unfolding it. Her fingers trembled, not with fear, but reverence. She read the verse once more, but this time aloud, softly. Even to your old age and gray hairs, I am he. I am he who will sustain you. The words floated in the room like a benediction. They settled in the corners, in the cracks of the walls, in the quiet between her breaths. She whispered, "You were never far, were you?" It wasn't a question, not anymore. Night came gently. No grand arrival, no sharp descent, just the quiet folding of day into dusk. The sky, a deepening blue, held the final traces of light like a secret it was not quite ready to let go. She didn't rush to turn on the lights. Instead, she sat still, letting the shadows stretch softly across the room. There was peace here now. Not because her questions had been answered, but because they had found a place to rest. And in that resting, they no longer demanded to be solved. They simply existed, honored, but no longer in control. She knelt beside the bed, not out of obligation, but instinct. The motion felt old and familiar, like returning to a forgotten language her soul still understood. Her hands folded slowly, her eyes closed, not to shut the world out, but to welcome something deeper in. She whispered. It wasn't polished or poetic. There were no grand declarations, no carefully chosen words, just breath and honesty. I don't know how to start again. I don't even know what tomorrow should look like. But if you're here, and I believe you are, I don't want to keep pretending I'm fine without you. The stillness that followed was different than before. Not empty, not uncertain. It was full of presence, of warmth, of something she couldn't name but had longed for without knowing. A soft tear traced its way down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. It belonged here, a testimony of something shifting. Not erased pain, but softened pain. Not a rescued life, but a surrendered one. Her breathing deepened. A weight lifted, not with drama, but with grace. It wasn't that everything was suddenly okay. It was that she didn't have to carry it all anymore. Not alone. In that moment, she thought of those she counseled, the broken-hearted, the weary, the silent sufferers. How often she had given them words of hope, prayers of comfort, encouragement to trust in what could not be seen. And now, she realized, the words were not just for them. They had always been meant for her too. She rose slowly, opened the window. The night air was cool and steady. The city murmured below in hushed voices. Life continued. But this time, she was a part of it, not just watching it pass her by. There would still be hard days. The ache of grief would return. Doubt might visit again. But now, she knew it would not find her empty, because something had taken root, something sacred, a quiet knowing, a sacred presence. She lit a candle, not because she needed more light, but because it felt right. The flame flickered, steady and small, but alive. It mirrored her heart. Before sleep came, she whispered once more, not out loud, but from within, a wordless offering, a prayer made of breath, of stillness, of surrender. Thank you. Not for fixing, not for explaining, but simply for being. And when she finally lay down, she rested, not just her body, but her soul. She no longer feared the silence, because now she knew it was never empty. It was always him.